It's an Archeo Death interview with Professor Howard Williams and his guest.
Welcome, Archeo Deathlings, to this latest Archeo Death interview with me, Professor Howard Williams, and my guest. And this time we have a wonderful guest, a newly doctored guest of Dr. Reanna Phillips. Hello, Reanna.
Hi.
Would you care to introduce yourself to us, our viewers, listeners?
I'd love to. So I am Dr. Reanna Phillips, new doctor. Thank you so much for having me. Just finished my PhD from the University of Chester in Roman death and burial in Roman Britain. There we go.
Well, this is what Archeo Death is all about, death and
Yeah.
burial, and we'll even let the Romans in on the discussion occasionally, despite people having mixed feelings about the Romans. If I tolerate the Vikings coming on this channel, I should definitely tolerate the Romans. But yes, thanks for welcome. And I really want to have this interview with you about your research and to learn a little bit more about your PhD and the broader scene in which it sits, really, and just see where it goes. But I wanted to get, if one of you start off, I think it's really important people know how you become a doctor of archaeology. How did you get here? So would you mind telling us how you got into archaeology?
I'd love to. So it's all thanks to Indiana Jones. That's it, right? To the core
That's
of
the
it,
wrong
behind
answer.
us
To stop.
all.
Edit. We're going to start again. No, go.
Interview done.
Yeah.
No,
I should do the
really, I
walk off.
think-
I should do the interview. I'm not having this. No,
Flip
great.
the
Go on. Sorry.
computer. So again, have to pour one out for Indiana Jones, have to also pour one out for The Mummy Returns. I think what it really is a lifelong obsession with history, with archaeology, with the ancient world, which grew into, a scholarly obsession, eventually going into classics, language, and archaeology, and then doing my first volunteer dig at a Roman fort, and I just never looked back.
Wow. So, what are the main lines of research that you've been conducting? Undergraduate, masters, PhD. Give us a little synopsis of what you've been learning about, and particularly researching as independent topics.
Yeah. So I come from a background in classics in my undergraduate. So looking at, in particular, vase paintings and portrayals of sympathetic and heroic kin killers. Again, a while back, but this was looking at, people like Orestes and Medea in plays and how sort of, their transgressions were portrayed in a sort of almost heroic and redeeming manner through the physical material culture, as well as in plays and whatnot. So again, I mean, that wasn't expressly burial or death related, but there's death involved. There's a little bit of the dark side. So
Tragedies always
eventually,
involve death, and
eventually got pulled into burial, mortuary funerary archaeology and in the masters at Chester.
Oh yes,
Death
of
and
course, you did the
Burial.
MA Archaeology of Death and
Yeah.
Memory. Yes.
Mhm. So, I did some excavations of burials and tombs in Italy, volunteer digs, as well as some medieval burials at a villa situated around a Roman villa. So again, more experience in the field than fueled scholarly interest in burial, and, investigating life through that response to death.
Exactly, and that's what mortuary archaeology is all about. It's about life, really, in many ways.
Yeah.
And did you? I mean, obviously, the ethics of all of this are something that people get very strong opinions about. I mean, did you? I mean, and also the the emotional aspect of this. I mean, the field work can be quite, even if it's very old burials, it can still
Yeah.
be quite touching. Was that something that hit you as well as learning about ancient cultures and the methods of excavation?
Oh, absolutely. I feel like getting that firsthand look, being able to, directly experience and respect, kind of recreate and reimagine, investigating, living people's response, not only the life of this person that's dead, but the people that were close to them, or, how they're responding to death and burial. I feel like that's just I would say my favorite, but a really fascinating look and a way to honor people from the past, and learn about their lives.
And your MA thesis was about Roman stuff, yeah?
Yeah. So, decapitation burials, again, not merely presumed to be a method of disrespect or execution, but sort of teasing out the nuances and again the motives, the experiences of people burying someone that has been decapitated for a myriad of reasons.
Heads just
Again,
fall off all the time
yeah,
in
right.
Roman
Again,
Britain.
more common in Roman Britain than you'd expect,
Yeah.
and the burials are more interesting than you'd expect as well.
It was a violent time. Well, I don't know. I don't know if it was a mixture of judicial execution and other practices going
It
on,
was
but
very likely a mixture, which again was the most fascinating thing.
and so that led you to do a PhD. Why? Oh, why? I mean, why, and what did you study?
I love the pain. That's why I did the PhD. So, but really, again, just a fascination and obsession with looking at in particular this period in Roman Britain through burial practices. Um, Again, looking at through the masters, that was very much a gateway into my PhD, and that particular topic didn't end up being a prominent focus in my PhD, which
Okay.
saddens me. But there's future chances. I looked at so much data, so much information, so much practices, which again is thrilling. It was daunting, but thrilling for future research. So
Before we get into your PhD, though, I mean, can I just
yeah.
get push you for a proper explanation? Why
Yes.
the Roman period in Britain, as opposed to Bronze Age Tajikistan or
Yeah.
the Iron Age of Japan, or what? Why Romans and why Britain and why death? You said, but why Romans? Why Britain?
I ask myself that every day. But
Why?
really, why? But really, again, having a classics background and always being drawn to Rome, as well as the empire, the expanse, Roman culture spread throughout elsewhere. And instead of focusing on Roman Italy and burial in Roman Italy, I just moving here to Britain, and then thinking about what it was like for people prior to Roman conquest, Roman invasion, Roman integration into the empire. Thinking about that, as well as the cultural background, the cultural mixing, and then over centuries, just became very fascinated with Roman Britain, as well as the burials specifically in this area.
So before we get into your PhD, what are burials like in Roman Britain? What do we know about them?
So
Decapitation, yeah, but what
right,
else?
right. Again, lots of weird stuff happening. So there's kind of a misnomer or a presumption that burials in Roman Britain are relatively uniform. So people
Okay.
think generally you're towards the beginning of the Roman period, towards 100, 200 CE, you generally have a lot of inhumations that eventually peters out into cremations. So there's very much a focus on these broad data, this broad perspective that overall you are supine, the dead are supine, the dead are perhaps in a coffin, perhaps not, in organized cemeteries outside settlements, never within. So in general, I think that's built up an idea that burials are very standardized. But again, don't want to get ahead of myself, but as the process of my PhD reveals, as well as increasing research outside, there's a lot more variations than expected in the process of each burial here.
So you have in the Iron Age there's a range of mixture of regional traditions, some cremation, but there's more cremation comes in with the Romans and inhumation takes back over.
Yeah,
On a
exactly.
slong. That's
Yes.
sort of a crude general. So there's no one Roman way of death, is the point, is there? There's no the Roman way. Let us honor her the Roman way. And then suddenly everyone, like a TV program, that's what I was trying to do. A parody. He must die like a Viking type cliche. There's no.
We all have a list we consulted. This is the handbook. This is the way, the diagram.
The Roman manual. I've consulted the manual. He said we must do this. No, there's nothing. So there's a lot of diversity, regional, local burial practice. By the end of Roman Britain, you've got these big inhumation cemeteries, but there's still a few cremations banging around, aren't there?
Yeah.
So you were trying to tackle that data set with two major modes of deposition, cremation,
Yeah.
inhumation. So what was your approach to all of that? Did you just look at the inhumations or the cremations, or did you look at everything?
So instead of picking a very narrowing in, maybe wisely narrowing in on a particular practice, a particular type, my PhD was very much stemmed out of, to be dramatic, a frustration with what I thought were perhaps limitations in the way we looked at burials. So
Okay.
I looked at people, again, rightfully so, narrowing in and providing really, really useful, detailed data and studies on particular practices, particular types of burial, cremation, inhumation, potential regionalities, material culture. And instead of narrowing in, I wanted to look at each burial as an extended process, because I was seeing lots of either similarities as well as diversities within these types that already, existed in scholarship. And to, not let those typologies limit what the interpretations, what we could learn about the whole process of each burial.
It's often said that death is a process. Perhaps you could give us a little bit more sense of what that means in archaeological terms, because obviously people don't immediately get died and tipped into a grave or
Right.
burnt on a pyre within seconds. So
Right.
I mean, what does it mean in archaeological terms when we talk about a process?
Yeah. So again, with the evidence that we can see, we can interpret, after death, there is a stage of preparation. There's, in Roman terms, likely in the home of the deceased, for
Okay.
a time, perhaps private rituals, preparation of the body. There's the transportation, because we know the burials are happening outside the city limits. There's an element of transportation, perhaps a performance, a procession. And again, this could be private, very public. There's archaeologically, we see evidence of, perhaps display within the grave cut above the burial at the
Oh,
surface.
yes.
Perhaps, you've stepped burials, perhaps, facilitating the close gathering, at a graveside of an inhumation or a pyre. So again, this is what benefits, I think, looking at this process of burial and the types, because there are commonalities, like perhaps graveside rituals happening at both a pyre side as well as an inhumation display. And then there's there's an elements of transformation. There's perhaps concealing, revealing the body and grave elements, deposition, and transformation through pyre, transformation through burial. We see that archaeologically. Yeah, and then again, further stages of performance. So I'm revealing my process here, but my focus is very much on what these practices, reconstructing these practices archaeologically as rituals, as performed moments.
So the decision to burn a body on a pyre versus
Yeah,
bury in the grave does lead to very
yeah,
different archaeological traces, but there are
definitely.
commonalities in both traditions that are operated in the
Exactly,
same
right?
communities.
Mm-hmm.
And we don't often know why some people are burned and some people are buried. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
it's not just they're all Christians if they're buried, and they're
No.
all
Mm-hmm.
pagans if they're cremated.
Mm-hmm. And there's very much again, there's increasing like carbon dating to more precisely understand these potential chronological changes. But what we do know is there is overlap. There are trends over time. There are traditions, again, regionally as well as overall, but there are simultaneous practices of cremation and inhumation at the same time throughout Roman Britain. So it's yeah, not as easy as it would be great, but it's not as easy as finding a really clear identifying factor, either with that individual or area, to understand precisely why those choices are made, but rather focusing on, again, the experiences of the people doing this, and
Yeah.
perhaps understanding the motives through that way, focusing on that participation.
So yours is a process, a processual approach in the sense of focusing on the process, and
Yeah.
inspired by recent theoretical approaches in burial archaeology. What were the main patterns of data that you found? What did you actually get out of this? Because you did look at a huge data set, right?
Definitely, yeah. So of 2,653 graves, 4
Wow.
sites in Roman Britain. I had
How many sites? Sorry, how many was that across? 4 or 5?
It was 4 main sites.
That's it.
And again, I had so many others lined up, ready to go. But you have to draw limits in a PhD. You can't be spending 25 years doing your PhD.
Well, I know people who are trying.
Yeah, you could. But yes. So overall, yeah, the analysis overall, my PhD, my process, looked at not only these overall big trends, these, looking at elements of that preparation, the transportation, these burial displays, that both the burial as well as, pyre collection after, all of these stages throughout each burial, and contextualizing the practices. So I had that element of big analysis, looking at the trends overall to understand these practices, but also never losing touch with the context. So for instance, body containers. So looking at how much people, how frequently people are provided some kind of container, coffin, or, urn, or again, looking at types of burials together. So instead of, if we say roughly between 40 and 50%, below 50% of burials within the data set across Roman Britain have a coffin. So it's not enough to say that, this is a clearly some kind of, economic, or trend. Instead, looking at what that means in the context of each grave, looking at the practices throughout the process, looking at what the body container might do in the burial instead of just contain a body.
What do you mean by that? What do you mean? What does it do? Because this is all agency stuff. Is it like the material agency of things in funerals? But I get very confused about all this. So give me a sense of what you mean by that.
All right. So for instance, we have a body with a burial in a container, a coffin.
Right.
So looking at, was the coffin covered? Was the coffin covered throughout the entire burial? So there's no element of interaction with the burial, interaction with the body. In most cases, you see evidence in the grave of interaction with that body, with the dead, between the living at the graveside. So again, this tells me that that there's these elements of performance throughout the funeral. So there's evidence of perhaps display, interaction, that there's important effects for the living to display their interaction, perhaps putting objects in the grave, perhaps displaying adornments, again, opportunities to interact at the graveside prior to either covering the coffin with a lid, a shroud, again, evidence of multiple moments of potential concealment and display, and what that does, what kind of effects that has on the individual, why these people are choosing to have multiple moments to cover and reveal the dead. This goes for cremations as well. And this is something I think that people hadn't considered, but the acts of placing a body on a pyre, potentially within a coffin.
Yes.
And then, again, you have those moments of concealment and display as well prior to cremation. You have interaction with the remains afterwards, either gathering the remains, and then you have potential placing the remains within yet another container, the urn. Perhaps another procession to the grave site. If it's not at the pyre site, there's perhaps a secondary cremation, perhaps number of days, weeks, months afterwards, or immediately.
So death can be quite drawn out as a process.
Exactly. And so there are many cremations that don't have urns. The majority do. I suspect this is because we see cremations more often when there's an urn present archaeologically.
Oh, that's true.
But there are many cremations that don't have urns. This tells me that there's perhaps containers used to transport the body, but not necessarily to contain them within the grave. So imagining the roles of containers beyond, a coffin in the grave, the body remains untouched by dirt. There's plenty of evidence of perhaps opened coffins or uncovered containers or bodies without containers, urns flipped upside down and placed so the remains aren't contained. Again, the performance or the role of containers in rituals beyond just a containment of the body.
Didn't you look at other kinds of artifacts too? And wasn't hobnail boots one of them, or
Yeah,
shoes? Oh, well,
yeah.
these are crazy things, but yeah, tell me
So,
about those.
again, considered a very common grave good in Roman Britain. We still probably see them in maybe 14 to 15 to 16%, maybe so a quarter of graves. So
That's a lot of footwear, though.
yeah. So it was a very common disposable object in Roman Britain. You see tons of them up at Vindolanda, preserved leather.
Oh yeah.
Super exciting. So they're very much a personal expression. So looking at, again, challenging kind of what we think about footwear, what we think about burials, the fact that you could see plenty of variation in the placement of shoes in graves. They're not often or not always worn at the feet. They're often placed elsewhere in the grave, either separately near the feet or around the arms, head, even sometimes outside the coffin. This reminds me of another reason, another shall we say, effect of the use of coffins in graves and other containers is placement of objects outside and around. So this depicts, again, those the ongoing performance, these ongoing rituals, not just the concealment of the body and then the burial and then it's over, but also that rituals and performances continue on throughout. The body's being buried, the cremation's happening, the urn is being buried, but yet there's objects being placed. There's perhaps feasts and music and rituals and public performances going on. And so most excitingly, I like to bring this up. Perhaps not just 2 shoes for each person, but 1 shoe or 3 shoes. It's
maybe they could choose the
frustratingly
shoes.
yeah, it's frustratingly hard to figure out because the hobnails often get disturbed. The only evidence of shoes in graves, the leather doesn't often make it. So they get jumbled around, but there's often clearly preserved signs, groupings that indicate that, again, shoes are placed all over in different quantities.
This isn't just like the five single gloves I found in my garage that are 4 right, 1 left. This is just where the rest all gone. But this is something. This is not just a random collection of half. People are clearly making decisions about placing these shoes with the dead, and it's not often they need them for the afterlife.
Right. Right. You even see potentially size disparities between the individual as well as the size of shoe. So again, this shows that there isn't a one-to-one, like these objects represent the dead. These objects are for the dead to use. There's more nuance to show about what the choices the living are making throughout the process of each burial.
So burial and funerals and the burial process was important in Roman Britain. It was incredibly varied and complex and multi-stage. What other kind, and you can see that decisions are not about necessarily the identity of the dead person, but what other kind of patterns did you find that were unexpected?
So another case study was that dress objects like jewelry, brooches, bracelets, hairpins, you would think that these would be most commonly, like the shoes, worn by the deceased. But in fact, more frequently, these objects are placed elsewhere in the grave. Sometimes both. Sometimes the deceased would be wearing a necklace with hairpins placed outside along the coffin, or again, grave cut, or in a cremation placed afterwards, so the objects had not been burnt, but perhaps placed in the burial at that later stage. So again, this shows not only that these choices are made perhaps by different groups of people. So if the body is prepared by close family likely in the home. Perhaps that's
Yeah.
the moment to adorn the deceased. And so objects placed separately in the grave later could represent opportunities for people to participate outside that social group, perhaps different individuals or prominent individuals. Perhaps it was, the family choosing instead to emphasize or display their participation by that later moment in the grave cut, interacting with the deceased, perhaps placing those 17 bracelets next to the head of this person. Again, they
Yes.
could be saying something important about the deceased or very much about themselves and their
So
representation.
this is very much an approach that doesn't emphasize, can we read off the identity of the dead person? Lots of objects is a wealthy person or a wealthy family. You're very
Mm-hmm.
much trying to think of the process and the
Yeah,
almost emotional relationships or
for
personalized
sure.
relationships with the dead. That's
That as
interesting.
well, yeah, that as well as like the social dynamics that could be going on in the wider community as
Oh
well.
yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So, can you give us any other case studies of how, of individual graves? I mean, it's difficult to do this without images, but I mean, is there anything that particularly grabbed you as a good case study that could show
Yeah,
us
yeah.
what kind of thing we're talking about? Maybe we could put a link and an image in the description or something. I don't know, but it'd be good if people had a sense of what you're talking about in terms of the
Definitely.
individual graves.
Definitely. So, um, a particular grave that grabbed me was in Roman York
Oh
in the
yes.
cemetery. A grave that had been really elaborately constructed over time, made of
Oh
many, many stone kists. So this just to me spoke to me of that extended process, that those early stages, the labor, and perhaps the wider networks of people involved in digging this grave cut and then placing these stones and in layers before these stone slabs were even laid. A single ceramic bowl was placed in the ground, and then layers and layers of stones placed atop, eventually making, a kist for the body. And then further, you know, building of this kist over time, eventually covering um the body in, in this kist, and then further layers of clay, etc., laid on over. So rather than thinking like this is a construction labor, a duty, perhaps it's thinking about the people that are involved throughout
yes.
this extended process and what what that participation might mean for them. Perhaps this wasn't simple, hiring of laborers, but perhaps this is people involving themselves in this extended performance. Again, over days, weeks, that this labor would take place,
So this
and
is
then
very
that.
much. Go on. Sorry.
Oh, it was like, and then what that process, like slowly concealing and covering the dead with more and more, just the gathering of all these slabs. They weren't just laying around nearby. This shows a lot of preparation, planning. And this is, again, a unique burial in that cemetery. So that choice to do this, um,
So
and what
there
the
are
experience
rules,
of the
there are
living.
form,
Yeah.
there's this formula, but there's also
Mm-hmm.
a lot of sort of innovation or experimentation or
Right.
attempts to personalize even. I don't know if that's the right phrase to use, but do you think that's fair?
Oh, definitely. Yeah, yeah. So you have that formula, like we talked about. Generally, you have inhumations or cremations. They fluctuate over trends, but yeah, those variations. When you look at that process and think about the involvement of people throughout the early stages of preparation, all the way through to the last moment. Again, we like to think like, where does the burial finally end? It's really hard
Yeah.
to say because you find, again, a lot of objects placed in grave shafts. So if the grave is quite deep, you
Oh,
find objects often considered rubbish in earlier site reports, but the sheer amount of coins and jewelry and whole animals, skulls placed at the very top, two horse skulls placed at the very top of a cremation cut where the urn is,
oh
several feet
wow.
deep. And so again, this tells me again that there are important and significant moments rituals performed by people, observed by people, going throughout this process to the very end. And again, perhaps revisitation. So,
or going back and opening graves.
yeah, could be opening, could be going back doing, further rituals, could be going back and thinking about the previous dead when you were burying someone new. So as burials,
you're always
right,
adding to existing burial grounds, and so
each burial does not exist in a vacuum. So it's thinking about the development over time, both on that individual scale as well as that big data,
no dead man is an
database
island.
style.
Yeah. No, but that's true. And so your approach is, do you think it has wider application elsewhere in the Roman Empire or other periods and places? I don't know.
Absolutely. So that's the beauty of looking at really focusing on exploring the participation, the evidence of these actions and choices made throughout, looking at looking at the archaeological evidence of that grave as it's excavated, and then, thinking through, what it took to prepare for that burial, what it took to bring the body from, place of death all the way through to this moment, what the individuals, what the members of the living did to prepare, both the material culture, both the construction of the grave, both, and again, through that process of preparing the body and making the grave end up that way.
Is this a particularly urban thing in Roman Britain and elsewhere, do you think, or do you think burials were complex and multi-staged even in rural settings, forts and other sites?
Definitely. Yeah. So the evidence for more rural burial, a little harder to get your hands on because there's probably tons of it that still has not been discovered. So a lot of what we say about burial in Roman Britain is about some of these major urban cemeteries that have been discovered, but there's, large projects in recent past that have been also bringing attention to those rural burial practices and those multi-stage extended process. Of even rural burial. And I didn't end up finishing answering your question, but yes, this process throughout looking at burials as a process would absolutely benefit, prehistoric, late medieval, modern burials of all time periods.
Sorry for cutting across you there.
No,
but yeah.
That was me. I got lost in what I'm saying, and then I forget to answer directly. So
that's cool.
Thank you.
So what's going to happen with your research now, Reanna? What do you want to do next, do you think? Where's it going?
So not only expanding across Roman Britain, further sites, I've got, even if I only limited the rest of my career only onto the 2,635 burials that I've already looked at, I already have plenty to say about more case studies, more practices, zeroing in on moments, and again, types of interactions, like decapitation, like looking at, ceramic objects where they're placed in the grave, looking at, objects placed in hands of the deceased. There's all sorts of interesting choices made by the living throughout burial that I think deserve and warrant further research, but also expanding beyond. I'd like to get like an even more wider look at Roman Britain, and again, well beyond further time periods even, but for sure across Roman Britain, as well as other provinces, other areas within the Roman world.
Oh, thank you. Where can folks find out more about you and your work?
So I've recently set up a WordPress homepage to make it easier to find what I'm doing if I'm doing future talks and publications and whatnot. So it's RS Phillips Archaeology at WordPress.com. And that'll be linked into my academia page and whatnot, and I'll keep that posted with my progressing research.
I'll put that link in the description. So is there anything else you'd like to tell us about your research that we missed out on?
Ooh, I mean, again, I could just keep going forever. So I appreciate the opportunity
No.
to just ramble about the things that I really enjoy about looking at a burial. But yeah, I've got, again, papers coming out. I've
Oh,
got potentially branching into a little bit of brewing, archaeology, experimental archeology.
not funerary
Um,
archaeology brewing,
yeah, well,
unless
again,
we consume
it's
it all at
pertinent.
awake. Yeah.
But also, yeah, looking at publication of my research. So yeah, stay posted. Mhm.
Okay, I shall put all the links in the description. And it's been fascinating hearing about this project and all the complexity of Roman burial. And I just want to say thank you very much, Dr. Phillips, for sharing your archaeodeath interview ideas with us. Thank you very much.
Thank you for the opportunity. Thank you.
If you've enjoyed this Archaeodeath video, why not check out the Archaeodeath blog at howardwilliamsblog.wordpress.com.